What if everything you were taught about the Vietnam War, the chaos, the failure of intelligence, the unwinnable conditions, was carefully edited to hide the most disturbing military operation ever conducted on foreign soil? What if the warriors who became so brutal, so psychologically devastating, that their own government sealed their records for 80 years were not mercenaries, but Americans? Before we reveal what the military buried in classified vaults across the Pentagon annexes, the National Archives, and the very ground of Vietnam itself, I need you to do something. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Second, hit that subscribe button, because this channel needs your help to keep bringing you the secret history they don't want you to know. The algorithms are already suppressing this content. Your subscription is the only thing keeping these stories alive. The official narrative tells us the Viet Cong mastered the jungle. They were the shadows. But in 1968, there was a group the Viet Cong feared more than B-52s. A group that forced enemy soldiers to surrender to nothing. The files say they were the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit, or SRU. The military says the files were destroyed in a fire. We say the ghost trackers were simply too effective to ever be allowed back home. In the suffocating humidity of the A Shau Valley, 1968, the rules of war ceased to apply. Technology had failed. The Viet Cong and the NVA had turned the canopy into a fortress, rendering radar and conventional tracking useless. But the real terror began when the silence started to hunt them. We have managed to piece together fragments from translated NVA diaries, salvaged decades later by a team of independent researchers in Hanoi. One entry, dated July 14, 1968, written by a private named Levan, describes an ambush, but not one by conventional forces. This was the signature of the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit, the SRU. Their very existence contradicted the official failures of U.S. intelligence. Where the Army saw an impassable, chaotic jungle, the SRU saw a map, a library of scents, and a network of vibrations invisible to the untrained eye. The need for a unit like this was born out of pure desperation. Standard U.S. Army doctrine relied on brute force, saturation bombing, and overwhelming firepower. But in the thick, multi-layered environment of Indochina, fire became a liability, and sound gave away position. The enemy was elusive, melting back into the shadows after every skirmish. The U.S. command realized they could not beat the Viet Cong at their own game. They had to invent a new game, one played entirely in the dark. The documents, or what little remains of them, point to a clandestine operation designated Project Sightless, initiated in 1966. Its directive was chillingly simple: create the perfect, biologically optimized jungle predator. The goal was to bypass the technological failures of the time, the cumbersome radios, the prone radar systems, and replace them with something ancient, primal, and terrifyingly efficient. The psychological impact of the SRU was their greatest weapon. Regular NVA and VC soldiers could rally against artillery or machine guns. They understood that violence. But the sheer terror of being neutralized by an unseen, unheard force created a paralyzing fear that spread faster than any chemical weapon. The myth of the Bong Ma Rung, the forest phantoms, was cultivated by accident, a powerful psychological weapon the U.S. military happily used. The problem, as Project Sightless directors would soon discover, was that when you create a perfect predator, it eventually stops recognizing the difference between its assigned prey and its creators. The seeds of the unit's future moral corruption and inevitable disappearance were planted right here, in the desperate hope that a man could be surgically separated from his humanity and returned when the job was done. The jungle, however, had other plans. It saw in the trackers men who were ready to be claimed. Project Sightless needed men who were already outsiders, already masters of environments that devoured technology. The initial recruitment pool bypassed conventional military channels entirely, focusing instead on two distinct groups: elite indigenous scouts, primarily from the Montagnard tribes of the Central Highlands, and deep woods survivalists from the Appalachia and Pacific Northwest. These recruits weren't chosen for physical strength or marksmanship. They were chosen for their unparalleled sensory acuity, a quiet understanding of the environment that military psychologists classified as pre-cognitive awareness. The Montagnards, in particular, brought generations of knowledge about the deep canopy, its smells, its warnings, and its rhythm. The program was headquartered far from the chaos of Saigon, deep within an undisclosed, highly guarded facility known only in documentation fragments as the Conservatory. This was not a military base. It was an experimental laboratory designed to push the human senses past their evolutionary breaking point. The core of Project Sightless was the concept of biological tuning. It was rooted in the premise that modern life had dulled human senses, and that through forced regression, these men could regain the hyper-awareness of their hunter-gatherer ancestors. The most controversial and darkest element of this tuning was the extensive use of sensory deprivation training. The recruits were subjected to weeks, sometimes months, inside modified isolation tanks, not just floating in darkness, but placed in environments designed to overload and then systematically remove one sense at a time. The tanks used carefully controlled sound frequencies, fluctuating temperatures, and even specially engineered low-level olfactory compounds designed to burn out and then hypersensitize the mucous membranes. The goal was to make a man so acutely aware of his body's internal vibrations and the external world's minute shifts that he could see in the dark through sound and feel a human presence through air pressure alone. Dr. Elias Thorne, a redacted name on the few documents available, oversaw the psychological manipulation. His notes, scrawled, erratic, and disturbing, described the men's transition. The results were undeniably successful. Recruits could track a man across whetstone and dense brush, blindfolded, relying only on the minute compression of soil and the transfer of body heat radiating through the foliage. They became biological sensors, moving weapons that required no batteries, no radio codes, and no logistical support beyond what they could find. But the price was immediate and severe. Thorne's reports quickly shift from scientific triumph to moral panic. Sleep patterns vanished. Non-verbal communication replaced speech entirely. The trackers became intensely sensitive to bright lights, loud noises, and the presence of crowds. They were achieving superhuman abilities, but they were rapidly losing the ability to function as men. The military had created their perfect instrument, but they had also created their most dangerous secret. Chapter 3 dives deeper into the horrific reality of the SRU's training, focusing on the point where skill transitioned into pathology, the bleeding edge of human perception. This was the moment the trackers went from highly skilled soldiers to something irrevocably altered. The training moved out of the clinical isolation tanks and into a replica of the Indochinese canopy, constructed in a restricted Nevada facility. Here, the final, most brutal stages of the sensory overhaul took place. One technique, detailed in a heavily redacted training manual, was known as the echo box. Recruits were made to sit in complete darkness, blindfolded and earplugged, and were then periodically subjected to bursts of specific, highly directional acoustic feedback. The sound was designed to mimic the exact frequency of a human heartbeat or shallow breathing through wet jungle foliage. The objective was to force the auditory centers of the brain to register these minute sounds as physical threats. A former technician, interviewed decades later under the condition of anonymity, described the effect. It was like teaching them to taste fear. They learned to feel the presence of the enemy, not just see them. They'd twitch before the sound was even registered. They had become pure reaction. The result was the development of the SRU's signature tactic, silent neutralization. These men did not carry heavy weapons. They preferred blades, compressed wire, and methods of physical restraint that guaranteed instant, silent incapacitation. They were the ultimate counter-guerrilla force, designed to move inside the enemy's perimeter and dismantle the unit from the core. However, the enhanced perception came at a catastrophic cost. Dr. Thorne's journals begin documenting perceptual instability. The technical term for the moment, the jungle began to consume the mind. The line between the sensory input, the scent of decay, the sound of a rustling leaf, and the interpreted reality, the enemy, the threat, began to collapse. Notes from a psychiatric evaluation in late 1967 paint a harrowing picture. Subject 9. Bravo refuses to enter any enclosed structure. He displays acute distress when separated from foliage. He states the trees whisper the movements of his blood. He is functionally a part of the environment we trained him to master. His utility is total, but his humanity is nil. This was the core tragedy. The better the trackers became at their job, the less they qualified as human soldiers. They were transitioning into environmental organisms, perfectly adapted, self-sustaining, and emotionally dead. The SRU was now ready for deployment. Their files, already marked with an extreme level of confidentiality, were prepped for official disappearance should the mission succeed too well. The U.S. military was about to unleash a weapon it knew it couldn't control. A force that smelled fear, moved like smoke, and most importantly, was already on the bleeding edge of total psychological collapse. Their introduction to the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not a deployment, it was a release. This is part 2 of the full story script, continuing the narrative structure and maintaining the required word count, 600-700 words, and investigative tone. This section covers chapters 4, 5, and 6, detailing the ghost tracker's success, their psychological fracture, and the ultimate act of friendly fire. The introduction of the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit, SRU, to the Ho Chi Minh Trail in early 1968 was, by every quantifiable measure, a strategic and terrifying success. The deployment was surgical, focusing on key enemy supply caches and command posts located deep within the neutral zones and across the highly restricted Cambodian border. These were areas where conventional U.S. forces could not, under any circumstance, be officially caught operating. The SRU was the military's first, truly deniable weapon. Their operational doctrine was simple: infiltrate, neutralize, and disappear. They did not engage. They vanished those they were sent to find. The primary targets were the logistical bottlenecks, the intelligence officers, the high-value engineers, and the seasoned Viet Cong commanders who thought the triple canopy jungle was their shield. Fragmented reports, often just short, coded messages relayed through a single specialized courier, began to trickle back to headquarters. They contained almost impossible statistics. One week-long operation resulted in the dismantling of 4 separate supply depots, the removal of 3 district commanders, and 0 casualties for the SRU. In one particularly chilling case, a forward observation post reported its entire garrison of 30 NVA soldiers neutralized over a 48-hour period. When an inspection team arrived, they found no defensive wounds, no bullet holes, only the unnerving absence of life. The psychological warfare was achieving a scale never before imagined. Enemy units were not just demoralized, they were convinced they were fighting an invisible, supernatural entity. This was when the term Bong Ma Rung, forest phantoms, moved from rumor to institutional fear within the NVA ranks. They didn't assign lookouts anymore. They assigned priests. We found several redacted field reports from conventional U.S. Army units operating near the DMZ that illustrate the tracker's impact and the confusion it generated. One entry from a captain serving with the 101st Airborne Division describes finding an NVA ambush site. The success reports were quickly followed by troubling observations from the SRU's own handlers. The trackers were exhibiting increasingly non-human behavior. They refused standard rations, subsisting solely on what they tracked and caught. Their reliance on scent and vibration meant they actively avoided vehicles and structured camps, which produced too much noise for their tuned senses. The unit was becoming a ghost, not just to the enemy, but to the entire U.S. chain of command. They had performed their mission too effectively, becoming an unmanageable force that existed outside the laws of engagement, the rules of war, and, increasingly, the realm of sanity. The asset was succeeding, but the operation was spiraling toward a critical point of no return. As the SRU's operational effectiveness peaked, so did their internal psychological collapse. This stage, clinically referred to as perceptual bleeding, was the result of Dr. Thorne's successful, but ultimately destructive, biological tuning. The trackers could no longer interpret the vast amount of sensory data flooding their system. The internal walls of the mind were breaking down. The unit's surviving fragmented journals, often written in code or symbolic drawings, document this terrifying transition. One entry, believed to be from a scout named Whisper, illustrates the absolute loss of self-identity. The core mechanism of perceptual bleeding was the inability to filter essential survival information from extraneous noise. Trained to register the minute vibrations of a footstep 100 meters away, the trackers' brains were simultaneously registering the movement of every insect, the decay of every piece of biomass, and the subtle shift of humidity. This sensory overload created a constant state of fight or flight, driving them into a permanent, hyper-aggressive, and paranoid mindset. They stopped using their names. They communicated through a series of guttural clicks, hand signals, and movements that mimicked animals, a highly effective, non-lingual form of communication in the field, but one that signaled their profound disconnection from human society. The military had created a paradox, a unit that was physically attached to the U.S. Army payroll, but psychologically fused with the Vietnamese jungle. Their handlers grew increasingly fearful. They realized that the primary loyalty of the SRU was no longer to the flag or the mission brief, but to the preservation of the delicate, silent balance of the jungle itself. Anything that broke that silence, a helicopter, a burst of M16 fire, a shouted command, was categorized as a threat. The commanders on the ground were left with a nightmarish dilemma, a unit that was saving lives and securing objectives with impossible efficiency, but which was also morphing into a completely unpredictable force. The inevitable question was posed in a sealed memo from a major general to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in September 1968. When the war ends, what do we do with the men who believe they are trees? The answer, as the next chapter reveals, was to categorize them not as heroes, but as unretrievable assets. The line between predator and soldier was fully erased. The inevitable clash between the ghost trackers and conventional forces, known as the incident at Firebase Zulu, serves as the dark climax of the SRU's operational phase. It was the moment the military realized the weapon they built was permanently defective and posed a greater risk to Allied forces than to the enemy. Firebase Zulu was a small, hastily established firebase operating near the border. It was under regular, harassing mortar fire and was manned by a standard infantry platoon. On a pitch-black, monsoon-drenched night, a 3-man SRU team, designated Unit Mongoose, infiltrated the wire. They weren't hunting the infantry. They were using the firebase as a temporary corridor, attempting to track a high-value NVA officer thought to be passing nearby. The disaster began because the SRU's tuned senses registered the U.S. soldiers, moving in the dark, speaking in muffled voices, and emitting the artificial smells of repellent and nicotine as non-jungle, non-natural targets. To Unit Mongoose, the platoon was an intrusion. It was noise. The military record of the incident is a confusing tangle of conflicting radio transcripts and psychological debriefings. The surviving infantrymen reported that the attack was silent, ruthless, and terrifyingly fast. They said they felt hands over their faces and pressure on their throats before they knew they were under attack. One sergeant, the sole survivor who managed to escape the immediate zone, testified that he saw one of the attackers. He was naked except for mud. His eyes, they didn't look at me. They looked through me, like I was a leaf. He wasn't shooting, he was hunting. The SRU team neutralized 7 U.S. soldiers before the remaining platoon opened fire indiscriminately into the darkness. Unit Mongoose, suddenly exposed to the overwhelming sound of automatic gunfire, immediately retreated, vanishing back into the monsoon night within seconds, leaving behind no bodies, no equipment, and no traceable evidence of their presence. The official report, immediately drafted and sealed by a field commander, concluded the casualties were the result of a close-quarters Viet Cong sapper attack, blaming enemy infiltration. But the truth was known in the highest echelons. The ghost trackers had deemed their own side a threat and acted on instinct. The incident at Firebase Zulu was the end of the SRU as an active asset. The decision was made instantly and ruthlessly. The unit was too effective, too alienated, and too dangerous to be allowed continued existence. The order was given: initiate Protocol Phoenix, the full and total institutional erasure of the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit. The men were now scheduled not for extraction, but for disappearance. This is part 3 of the full story script, completing the narrative structure and maintaining the required word count, 600-700 words, and investigative tone. This section covers chapters 7, 8, and 9, detailing the cover-up, the mystery of the missing files, and the final enduring legacy of the ghost trackers. Following the incident at Firebase Zulu, the Pentagon activated Protocol Phoenix, the total institutional erasure of the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit. This was not merely a matter of classification. It was the systematic, bureaucratic deletion of their existence. The goal was to ensure that if the trackers were ever captured, killed, or eventually returned, the U.S. government could truthfully claim they were never U.S. military personnel. The first step was the paper purge. All operational logs, training manifests, and psychological evaluations related to Project Sightless and the SRU were collected under a single, highly restrictive security clearance. These files, estimated to fill over 10 cubic feet, were ordered moved to an isolated, rarely used storage facility, designated as the National Personnel Records Center, Annex C, in Missouri, far from the Central Military Archives. The final act of the SRU's disappearance occurred in July 1973. The official military record states that a localized fire, attributed to faulty electrical wiring, broke out at Annex C, specifically targeting the subsection containing all SRU documentation. Though the damage to the overall facility was minimal, the fire completely consumed the specific area holding the ghost tracker's files. The final status stamp placed on the records was chillingly final: total data loss. This fire was suspicious for multiple reasons. First, Annex C was a modern, climate-controlled storage facility built with state-of-the-art fire suppression systems that, by every standard, should have contained or extinguished a localized electrical fire instantly. Second, the fire started specifically in the section housing the most politically toxic, deniable assets of the war. The former head archivist of the facility, a man named Robert Hayes, spoke on the record years later, claiming that the fire was not an accident. The cover-up extended to the men themselves. The remaining operational trackers, now scattered and hunted by their former handlers, were classified as unretrievable assets. Military intelligence stopped hunting them for capture and began hunting them for liquidation. It is now widely accepted among researchers of deep black ops that most of the SRU were never successfully extracted. Instead, they vanished into the landscape they had been engineered to inhabit. Stripped of their identity, cut off from all official support, and psychologically incapable of reintegrating into civilization, the men became permanent phantoms in the jungle canopy. The military, having lost the war, had now also lost the men who were too good at fighting it. Their fate was sealed not by the Viet Cong, but by the cold calculations of an institution eager to sanitize its darkest secrets. The story of the ghost trackers should have ended with the fire in 1953. But secrets, especially those built on extreme psychological trauma and biological alteration, rarely stay buried. The legacy of the SRU persisted not in official documents, but in the persistent, chilling rumors coming out of the Indochinese peninsula long after the war ended. Decades later, local hunters, montagnard tribesmen, and even illegal loggers have reported encounters with figures described as unnatural or too quiet in the deep, unmapped areas of the border triangle, the very heart of the former neutral zones. These accounts share striking similarities. Figures that move on all fours, eyes that reflect light unnaturally, and the immediate overwhelming scent of ozone and fear. These are not the reports of ghosts, but of highly adapted biological entities. One civilian account, given to a German anthropologist in 1998, described a confrontation with two such figures. While these accounts are impossible to verify, they underscore the central theory. The SRU did not die. They simply completed their metamorphosis. They were soldiers who became creatures, perfectly suited for survival in the most hostile environment on Earth. Furthermore, investigative reporters have uncovered evidence that elements of Protocol Phoenix were folded into later, deep, black-budget programs, suggesting the concept of biologically enhanced, untraceable reconnaissance never left the Pentagon's drawing board. The technology and psychological data harvested during Project Sightless were too valuable to destroy. Coded entries from a 1980s defense appropriations bill show funding directed toward stealth biotech adaptation, a program that sounds suspiciously like a continuation of the SRU's core mission, albeit with technological enhancements. The military realized that the perfect tracker didn't need to be American. It just needed to be effective. The original ghost trackers became the living blueprints for a new generation of warfare. The men who started as Appalachian hunters and montagnard scouts became an enduring myth, a spectral warning about the moral consequences of genetic and psychological warfare. They are the men who successfully disappeared from reality, becoming what the enemy believed them to be, the true, unkillable spirits of the jungle. The story of the ghost trackers of Vietnam is not a story of victory or defeat. It is a story of total moral loss. The men of the Spectral Reconnaissance Unit were the most unstoppable soldiers the U.S. ever deployed in the region, achieving impossible objectives and striking a terror into the enemy that conventional forces never could. Yet, they remain nameless, unmemorialized, and officially non-existent. Their effectiveness demanded their erasure. The U.S. military realized that you cannot bring a man who hunts by scent, rejects spoken language, and views civilization as a foreign threat back to the suburbs of America. The cost of their knowledge, the weaponization of primal human instinct, was the destruction of the men who wielded it. The final irony lies in the classification placed upon their existence: total data loss. This wasn't just a label for a burnt file cabinet. It was the final, cold epitaph for the men themselves. They were so effective at becoming unseen that the only way to contain their secret was to make them unremembered. The questions that linger today are the true measure of the conspiracy. Did the military choose to destroy the files because the trackers had been liquidated? Or did they destroy the files because they knew the trackers were still out there, surviving in the deep jungles, too wild to be called human, yet too potent to be ignored? The disappearance of the SRU serves as a chilling blueprint for future deep black operations. The Pentagon learned that the best way to manage an asset too dangerous for peacetime is not to retire it, but to delete it. The ghost trackers did not vanish from the jungle. They were simply never meant to be found by us. They remain bound to the humid canopy, permanent phantoms, hunting echoes of the war that created them. They are the shadows the U.S. Army created, and then feared. And in the silent, uncut jungle, the fear continues. If this story shocked you, hit that like button and share it widely. Your engagement is the only defense against the history they want to keep hidden. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, not all history is written in books. Some of it is still moving in the shadows.